In 1947, Europe was starving, bankrupt, and on the verge of collapse. Then America stepped in with $13 billion in aid. It looked like salvation. But behind that lifeline was a financial strategy so precisely constructed that the countries which accepted it were still living inside its architecture 70 years later, and most of them never fully understood the terms they had agreed to. The program was called the European Recovery Program. The world called it the Marshall Plan, and the version taught in every classroom presents it as the most generous act in the history of international relations, a superpower extending a helping hand to a wounded continent with nothing asked in return. Here is what was actually asked in return. Countries that accepted American aid were required to open their markets to American goods. They were required to dismantle the trade barriers that had protected European industry for decades. They were required to coordinate their economic policies through American-supervised institutions. And Britain, the largest single recipient, was specifically required to make the pound-sterling convertible into dollars as a direct condition of receiving the money. When Britain complied in July of 1947, the result was a financial catastrophe. Within 6 weeks, nations holding sterling balances had drained nearly $1 billion from British reserves. The pound never recovered its pre-war status as a global reserve currency. The British Empire had entered the Second World War as the dominant financial power on Earth. It emerged from the Marshall Plan as a dollar-dependent economy whose imperial trade network had been systematically dismantled by the conditions attached to American aid. This was documented in the internal correspondence of the men who designed the program. Dean Acheson, who would succeed Marshall as Secretary of State, stated directly that European recovery was crucial for American economic interests. William Clayton, the cotton businessman who helped design the plan, warned President Truman that without immediate American intervention, European markets would collapse and American producers would lose their most important customers. These were not men making humanitarian arguments. They were men who understood precisely what a rebuilt Europe would mean for American exports, American corporations, and American financial dominance. The Marshall Plan was not charity. It was the mechanism through which America replaced Britain as the world's banker and locked Western Europe into a dollar-centered financial order that could not be made operational without $13 billion and 17 nations desperate enough to accept whatever terms were offered. This is the documented story of how that transaction actually worked. The congressional records are public. The State Department cables are in the National Archives. The ECA program documents are available to any researcher willing to read them. And together they tell a story about the relationship between American generosity and American financial interest that the official account has been summarizing rather than examining for over 70 years. The standard account of the Marshall Plan begins with Marshall's speech at Harvard. The real story begins 18 months earlier, in the winter of 1946, when the scale of Europe's collapse became impossible to manage and the men in Washington realized that generosity and self-interest were pointing in exactly the same direction. By the end of 1945, European industrial production had fallen to approximately a third of its pre-war levels. In Germany, whose industrial capacity had been the engine of continental European output for half a century, production had essentially stopped. The Ruhr Valley, which had produced half of Germany's steel and coal before the war, was operating at roughly 10% of capacity. Coal shortages rippled outward from Germany across the entire continent. Without coal, there was no steel. Without steel, there was no reconstruction, and without reconstruction, there was no employment. Without employment, there was no tax revenue. Without tax revenue, there was no government capable of managing any of it. France was still rationing food in 1947, 2 years after the war ended. Agricultural output had collapsed because farms had been fought over, occupied, stripped of equipment, and in many areas left mined. The French government was simultaneously managing food rationing, coal rationing, and a currency that was losing value faster than wages could keep up with. Industrial workers in Paris were taking home pay packets that bought less each month than the month before. The Communist Party, offering a Soviet model that at least promised stable prices and guaranteed employment, was polling at over 25% in French national elections. Italy was in a comparable position. Its northern industrial cities had been battlegrounds. Its southern agricultural regions had been occupied by 4 separate armies in sequence. Its banking system was technically insolvent. Its currency, the lira, had lost 90% of its pre-war value. In the municipal elections of 1946, the Italian Communist Party received 39% of the vote in Rome. Britain's situation was different in character but equally acute. Unlike France and Italy, Britain had not been occupied. Its industrial base was largely intact. But 6 years of total war had consumed its foreign exchange reserves, its overseas investments, and its ability to service the debts it had accumulated to fight the war. Britain owed money to Canada. It owed money to the United States under the terms of the Anglo-American Loan of 1945, a loan whose conditions included the sterling convertibility clause that would produce the 1947 crisis. And it owed money to India, Egypt, Australia, and the other countries of the sterling area that had supplied goods to Britain during the war and accepted sterling IOUs in return. The total of these sterling balances, the accumulated debt Britain owed to the countries of its own empire, was approximately £3,500,000,000. Britain had no realistic means of repaying them. In February of 1947, the British government made the announcement that sent genuine shock through Washington. Exhausted and broke, Britain was withdrawing its military and financial support from Greece and Turkey. It was spending £27 million a year supporting the Greek government against a communist insurgency and could no longer afford it. The message to Washington was direct. If the United States did not replace British support in Greece and Turkey within weeks, both countries would fall to Soviet-backed forces. And if they fell, the entire eastern Mediterranean, the gateway to the Middle East, to Suez, to the oil fields that powered European recovery, would be open to Soviet penetration. President Truman's response to the British withdrawal was the Truman Doctrine, announced in March of 1947, which committed the United States to supporting free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. This was the public framing. The private framing, documented in State Department cables, was considerably more specific. If Greece and Turkey fell, the financial and strategic cost to the United States of containing Soviet expansion across the Middle East and North Africa would dwarf anything that preventing it in 1947 would cost. George Catlett Marshall returned from a foreign ministers' conference in Moscow in the spring of 1947 deeply shaken. He had spent weeks watching Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov deliberately stall negotiations over Germany's future while Europe deteriorated around them. Marshall came away convinced that Stalin was simply waiting for Western Europe to collapse under its own economic weight, so that Soviet influence could fill the vacuum without a single shot being fired. His response was the speech at Harvard. The proposal was deliberately framed in the broadest and most generous possible terms. Marshall even offered the program to the Soviet Union. American strategists were virtually certain that Stalin, who was deeply suspicious of any program requiring the opening of Soviet economic records to Western scrutiny, would refuse. He did, immediately and forcefully. Stalin not only rejected the Marshall Plan for the Soviet Union, but actively pressured Eastern European governments who had initially expressed interest, most notably Poland and Czechoslovakia, to reject it as well. The world was dividing in real time, and the Marshall Plan was the dividing line. The Marshall Plan was announced 3 months after Truman's doctrine speech. It was not designed in a moment of generosity. It was designed in a moment of strategic calculation, by men who understood that the alternative to rebuilding European markets was a Soviet-dominated continent that would be both a security catastrophe and a commercial disaster for the American economy that had just spent 4 years converting to. Wartime production and now needed markets to sell into. If you have not subscribed to the channel yet, please do it now. This is exactly the kind of financial history we cover, the documented mechanisms behind the events that shape the modern world. Every subscriber genuinely matters to what we are building here. Now hold that picture. A continent in which the largest economies are simultaneously unable to feed their populations, unable to pay their governments, and watching communist parties absorb the political despair of millions of people with nothing left to lose. A Britain so financially exhausted that it is withdrawing from commitments that have anchored Western strategic interests for a generation, and an America staring at the prospect of its most important export markets collapsing into Soviet economic orbit while its own factories are still producing at wartime capacity with nowhere to sell the output. Because what happened next? The specific financial mechanics of how $13 billion was deployed is the part of the Marshall Plan story that the classroom version consistently replaces with the image of a generous superpower writing a check for a wounded ally. The Marshall Plan was administered by a new American agency called the Economic Cooperation Administration. The ECA did not simply wire money to European governments. It stationed American officials, many of them senior executives from American corporations and financial institutions, inside the economic ministries of sovereign European nations. These officials reviewed funding requests, approved or denied allocations, and directed money toward projects and sectors that aligned with American strategic and commercial objectives. A 1948 analysis described the ECA administrator as a virtual economic czar with sweeping powers over the financial decisions of sovereign European governments. That description was not hyperbole. The first critical mechanism was called counterpart funds. When the American government sent $100 million worth of goods, food, machinery, raw materials, to France, the French government did not receive those goods without obligation. It was required to deposit the equivalent value in French francs into a special account. That account could then be used for domestic investment, but only with ECA approval. American officials therefore held authority not only over what goods Europe received, but over how European governments deployed their own domestic currency within their own borders. This was a degree of financial oversight over sovereign nations that had no precedent in the history of international relations. In West Germany, the counterpart fund system was deployed with particular precision. 40% of the total investment in the German coal industry between 1949 and 1950 came directly from counterpart funds directed by American officials. German companies that received these investments were required to repay them to the government, which then recycled the capital to the next group of businesses. This revolving credit system, designed and supervised by American officials, channeled American-directed capital into German industrial reconstruction for decades after the Marshall Plan formally ended. The institution it created, the Kreditanstalt für Wiederaufbau, still operates today as one of Germany's most powerful state development banks. The Marshall Plan's financial architecture outlasted the Marshall Plan by 70 years. The second major condition was trade liberalization. Every recipient nation was required to eliminate the protective tariffs and trade barriers that had been standard features of European economic policy before and during the war. This was presented as a matter of European economic efficiency and continental integration. The practical result was that American corporations, which had been largely excluded from European markets by protectionist barriers before the war, found themselves operating in a dramatically more open competitive landscape. The ECA's own mission statement included the explicit objective of facilitating international trade, especially with the United States. The language is in the program's own documentation. European recovery was not simply a humanitarian objective, it was a commercial one. Europe needed to become wealthy enough to buy American goods, and the removal of trade barriers was the mechanism that made European markets accessible to American producers. The third condition was the sourcing requirement. Countries importing specific raw materials and manufactured goods under the Marshall Plan were frequently required to source those goods from American suppliers. A substantial portion of the $13 billion in aid therefore returned to the American economy almost immediately in the form of payments to American farmers, American manufacturers, and American corporations. In the first year of the program, more than half of all Marshall aid was spent on food and agricultural products, primarily American food and American agricultural products. A business publication called Kiplinger Magazine printed a guide for its readers explaining how to profit from the Marshall Plan. The American business community understood with complete clarity what was being offered to them. The fourth condition, and the one that produced the most significant long-term consequences, was the requirement for European economic coordination. Recipient nations were required to manage their recovery through a new organization called the Organization for European Economic Cooperation. For the first time in European history, rival national governments were required to agree on common production targets, share economic data, coordinate trade policies, and align their currency practices with each other and with the dollar. This was the institutional requirement that would eventually produce the European Common Market, the European Economic Community, and ultimately the European Union. The Marshall Plan did not create European integration as a deliberate objective, but it created the institutional habits and bureaucratic frameworks that made integration structurally inevitable. The European Union as it exists today bears the institutional fingerprints of conditions that American officials required in 1948. Beyond the financial conditions, the Marshall Plan included an extensive program of technical assistance whose cultural implications were as significant as its economic ones. American experts were dispatched to European factories, farms, and businesses to advise on production methods, management techniques, and organizational practices. Simultaneously, delegations of European managers, technicians, and labor leaders were brought to the United States to tour American factories and observe American production methods. Dutch soap manufacturers were shown how to cut processing time from 5 days to 2 hours using new machinery. Norwegian fishermen were introduced to net designs that dramatically improved their catch. In France in 1945, only 25,000 tractors were working French agricultural land. By 1949, Marshall Plan aid had put another 200,000 tractors into the field. The overwhelming majority were American manufactured. This was not simply about efficiency. It was about embedding American industrial methods, American management philosophy, and American consumer-oriented economic thinking into the fabric of European business life at the precise moment when European business was being rebuilt from the ground up. Britain received the largest single allocation of Marshall Plan aid, approximately $3,230 million over the program's 4 years. It also paid the highest price of any recipient for accepting it. The price had actually been set 2 years before the Marshall Plan began. The Anglo-American Loan of 1945, negotiated by John Maynard Keynes on behalf of the British government in the final months of the war, provided Britain with $3,750 million in American credit to service its post-war debts. The loan carried a specific condition. Sterling, the pound, would be made fully convertible into dollars within 1 year of the loan being ratified. Britain's negotiators understood that this was premature. Keynes himself described the convertibility requirement as a noose around Britain's neck. He negotiated as hard as he could to soften the terms. He failed. On the 15th of July 1947, sterling became convertible. The result was immediate and catastrophic. Nations that had accumulated sterling balances, countries that had sold goods to Britain during the war and accepted pounds in payment, including India, Egypt, Australia, and Argentina, immediately began converting those sterling holdings into dollars. Within 6 weeks, the drain on British dollar reserves had reached almost $1 billion. The Bank of England was hemorrhaging its entire dollar reserve at a rate that would have exhausted it within months. On the 20th of August 1947, after just 36 days of convertibility, the British government suspended the arrangement. The convertibility crisis of 1947 was the moment the British pound's status as an international reserve currency effectively ended. Before the war, sterling had been the currency of global trade across a quarter of the Earth's surface, the British Empire and the sterling area that surrounded it. After 1947, sterling was a managed currency that could not freely convert, could not compete with the dollar as a store of international value, and could not anchor the global trading system it had dominated for a century. Britain had entered the war as the world's creditor. It emerged from the Marshall Plan as the world's largest debtor, owing money to its own colonies, to Canada, to the United States, and to the international institutions whose architecture Washington had designed. The men in Washington who had written the convertibility requirement into the Anglo-American loan understood what it would do. The State Department cables from 1945 document American officials acknowledging that full convertibility was more than the British economy could sustain at that point. They required it anyway. The strategic objective: eliminating the sterling area as a competing currency bloc that excluded American trade, was more important than the short-term financial stability of the ally that had helped win the war. This is the kind of documented financial history that the standard account almost never tells you directly. If this channel is new to you, please subscribe now. We cover the paper trail behind the official version of events, so we now have the complete picture. $13 billion deployed through an agency staffed by American corporate executives who held approval authority over the domestic spending of sovereign European governments. Trade barriers dismantled to open European markets to American goods. Sourcing requirements that returned a substantial portion of aid money directly to American suppliers. And Britain specifically required to make sterling convertible, a condition that produced the financial crisis that ended the pound's status as a global reserve currency and dismantled the sterling area that had been the primary competitor to dollar dominance in international trade. Because what the next question forces us to examine is what America actually received in return for its $13 billion investment, and whether the return on that investment makes it the most profitable financial transaction in the history of the 20th century. By the early 1950s, when the Marshall Plan formally concluded, the transformation of Western Europe was already profound. Industrial production across the continent had increased by 35% between 1948 and 1952, reaching levels 25% above pre-war output. Agricultural production had recovered to pre-war levels by 1949. Per capita GDP across Western Europe grew by 33% between 1948 and 1951. The psychological transformation was equally significant. In France and Italy, where communist parties had been polling at alarming levels in 1946 and 1947, the political stabilization that Marshall Aid helped produce blunted the appeal of the Soviet model at the precise moment when Western democratic governments were most vulnerable. But the return that mattered most to the architects of the plan was not measured in European industrial output or European political stability. It was measured in American commercial access, American institutional influence, and American monetary dominance. American corporations established commercial networks, trade relationships, and brand presences across Western Europe during the Marshall Plan years that did not evaporate when the aid ended. They deepened and expanded. The open European markets that the plan's trade liberalization conditions had created became the foundation of American corporate expansion into Europe that continued for the next 3 decades. By the 1960s, American multinational corporations, General Motors, Ford, IBM, Standard Oil, were so deeply embedded in European economies that the French journalist Jean-Jacques Servan-Schreiber published a book called The American Challenge, warning that Europe was being economically colonized by American corporate power. He was describing a process that the Marshall Plan had made structurally possible. The institutional legacy was equally durable. The Organization for European Economic Cooperation, created as a Marshall Plan requirement, became in 1961 the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which still sets global economic standards and policy frameworks today. The European Payments Union, established in 1950, created the first functioning framework for free currency exchange among European nations and was the direct institutional ancestor of the euro. The Marshall Plan did not create the European Union, but the cooperative institutional habits it made mandatory in 1948 created the bureaucratic and political architecture without which European integration would not have been possible. NATO, established in 1949, emerged directly from the same strategic environment that produced the Marshall Plan. The security guarantee that NATO provided was the military complement to the economic framework the Marshall Plan established. American military protection and American economic reconstruction were 2 instruments of the same strategic objective, a Western Europe that was stable, open, and aligned with American interests rather than Soviet ones. The dollar's position as the world's reserve currency, established at Bretton Woods in 1944 and operational in theory, but not yet in practice, was cemented by the Marshall Plan in the most direct way possible. $13 billion of American currency flowed into European economies that had almost none. European nations accumulated dollar reserves because the plan required them to conduct their trade in dollars. The dollar gap that had paralyzed European reconstruction became a dollar surplus that locked European monetary systems into dollar dependency. When you have no choice but to hold dollars because all your trade is denominated in dollars and all your debts are payable in dollars, the exorbitant privilege of the dollar, the ability to print money that the entire world must accept, becomes structurally irreversible. The Marshall Plan made dollar hegemony not just a policy but a physical reality embedded in the reserve holdings of every central bank in Western Europe. The American economy itself benefited in ways that the standard account consistently underemphasizes. The fear that haunted American economic planners in 1946 and 1947 was a return to Depression conditions. Wartime production had ended. Military spending was falling. The domestic economy needed export markets to absorb the output of factories that had spent 4 years producing at maximum capacity. The Marshall Plan, by creating vast European demand for American goods at precisely the moment when the American economy needed export markets most urgently, helped prevent the post-war depression that many economists had predicted. American GDP grew from $228 billion in 1945 to just under $1 trillion by 1970. The Marshall Plan was not the only factor in that growth. It was unambiguously a contributing one. The Marshall Plan cost the United States $13.3 billion. In today's money, that represents approximately $150 billion, a significant sum by any measure but roughly equivalent to what the United States currently spends on its military in 6 weeks. In return, America received a Western Europe whose currencies were pegged to the dollar, whose markets were open to American goods, whose trade was conducted under rules written in Washington, whose developing institutions bore the structural fingerprints of American required coordination frameworks, and whose monetary systems were so thoroughly integrated into dollar dependency that any future attempt to create an alternative reserve currency would require dismantling an architecture that had been embedded for decades. It also received the effective elimination of sterling as a competing global reserve currency, the single most important monetary objective of American financial policy since the 1930s, without firing a shot, without imposing a formal treaty, and while being publicly celebrated as the most generous nation in the history of international relations. The men who designed the Marshall Plan were not cynical men in the simple sense. George Marshall himself was not a cynical man. The genuine horror of what had happened in Europe, the human cost, the scale of suffering, the moral responsibility that American policymakers felt toward allies who had bled alongside them, was real. Dean Acheson and William Clayton and Paul Hoffman believed simultaneously that European recovery was strategically essential for America and that it was morally right. History is rarely tidy enough to offer clean moral verdicts, and the Marshall Plan is not an exception. But the documents are clear about what was designed, what was required, and what was received. The ECA's own mission statement included explicit objectives about facilitating trade with the United States. The State Department cables document American officials acknowledging that sterling convertibility would damage Britain while requiring it anyway. The counterpart fund agreements document American officials holding approval authority over the domestic spending of sovereign European governments. The trade liberalization conditions document the deliberate dismantlement of barriers that had excluded American corporations from European markets. The Marshall Plan is in the National Archives. The ECA program documents are publicly available. Dean Acheson's memoirs, Present at the Creation, document his thinking with remarkable candor. William Clayton's memoranda to President Truman are in the Truman Presidential Library. The Bank of England's account of the 1947 sterling crisis is in its own published history. The paper trail is open. And what it shows is not a conspiracy. No secret meeting, no single document, no single decision tells the whole story. What it shows is the systematic alignment of American strategic interest and American commercial interest that produced a program of reconstruction so elegantly designed that the countries it rebuilt were simultaneously its primary beneficiaries and the foundation of its donors' global financial. Dominance. Was Europe bought by America? The documents suggest a more precise answer. Europe was rebuilt by America, on American terms, in American currency, through American supervised institutions, with conditions that opened European markets to American goods and eliminated the competing monetary architecture that had previously limited American financial reach. Whether that constitutes being bought depends on whether you think the terms were fair. The people of Europe who ate American food in the winter of 1948 and whose children grew up in countries that did not fall to communism experienced something that felt like rescue. The finance ministers who signed the conditions experienced something closer to a transaction. Both experiences were real. Both are documented. And the paper trail that records both of them is in the archives, available to anyone willing to read what the Marshall Plan actually was beneath the story that has been told about it for 70 years. If this is the kind of forensic financial history you have been looking for, please subscribe to the channel. And if this video changed how you think about a program you thought you already understood, share it with someone who still believes the Marshall Plan was simply an act of generosity. Leave a $sign in the comments if you made it to the end. It seems appropriate. I will see you in the next one.